You're listening to the Immortal Icons of Dance podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Johnson. Today's episode is very special to me for a couple of reasons. It's the 10th interview that I've done, and it'll be the final one for this first season of Immortal Icons of Dance. I'll be taking a hiatus through the holidays, and we'll be back with more in the new year. I also thought it would be special to go out with a bang and talk about one of my favorite dance icons. We've covered ballet, tap, jazz, modern, theater, and hip-hop in this first season, but until today, we haven't talked about anyone who's primarily known for their dance work on film. Today, that changes. We'll be talking about Gene Kelly, a giant in the world of Hollywood dance. Gene Kelly was born in 1912 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When he was 8, he began dance classes along with his brother and sisters, but he didn't become serious about dance until later on. When he was 18, his family opened a dance studio and 2 years later renamed it the Gene Kelly Studio of Dance, where he taught for 7 years. After his time in college, where he majored in economics, he set out for New York City. Unable to find work in his first go-around, he returned to Pittsburgh as a choreographer for the Pittsburgh Playhouse. Gene's first appearance on Broadway came in 1938 at the age of 26 in the show Leave It to Me. He also appeared in One for the Money and The Time of Your Life. Finally, his big break came in 1940 when he landed the role of Joey Evans in the Broadway production of Pal Joey. He was a hit, and Hollywood took notice. In 1942, he made his film debut in For Me and My Gal with Judy Garland. Over the next 50 years, Gene appeared in or choreographed for 29 films and countless television programs and specials. Notable among the films are On the Town, Singin' in the Rain, Summer Stock, and An American in Paris. When Gene wasn't on screen, he was choreographing or directing for film, television, or theater. He was the choreographer of the Broadway show Best Foot Forward, starring a young Liza Minnelli, and he directed Flower Drum Song on Broadway. Some of the films he directed include Hello Dolly, starring Barbra Streisand, and Invitation to the Dance. In 1982, Gene was a recipient of the Kennedy Center Honor, and in 1994, he was awarded the National Medal of Arts. To talk with us today about Gene is his widow, Patricia Ward Kelly. Patricia is a film historian and the official biographer of Gene Kelly. She has worked as a writer at a film production company, as a contributing scholar for the authoritative Northwestern Newberry writings of Herman Melville, and as a freelance journalist. She and Kelly met at the Smithsonian in 1985 when she was the host and narrator for a television special for which she was a writer. Soon after, he invited her to California to write his memoirs, a job for which she recorded his words nearly every day for over 10 years. They were together until his death in 1996. She is currently working on the completion of the book about her late husband. As part of this work, she is preserving and cataloging the Gene Kelly Archives, an extensive collection of letters, manuscripts, photographs, scripts, interviews, essays, poems, holograph notes, and memorabilia that will eventually be the basis of additional publications and, ultimately, the core of an innovative, virtual Gene Kelly experience. Patricia and I had a very lovely and lengthy talk, so I hope that you stay tuned and enjoy. Today on the podcast, we are welcoming Patricia Ward Kelly to talk with us about her experiences with her late husband, Gene Kelly. So welcome, Patricia.
Oh, thank you so much. I can't tell you how excited I was when I got your invitation to be on the show. It's really an honor for me. Thank you.
And likewise. All right, could you first start off by telling us about how you first met Gene? What was your first experience with him as a person or with his work?
Well, as some people will know, the grand irony that I was one of the few people in the world who did not know who Gene Kelly was when I met him. So I was brought on as a writer on a television special about the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And it turned out that he was the host narrator. And I was just this very nerdy Herman Melville scholar, and I had been hired to work on this project. And so what was so interesting was that everyone on the set was going crazy. They were all just talking about this person named Gene Kelly who was about to arrive, and then they were all talking about this thing called Singin' in the Rain that they said was to die for. And I honestly did not know what they were talking about. And I even remember walking on the street in Virginia with the producer, and they're talking about it, and I just didn't want to show my ignorance, so I just went right along. And the director was a lovely guy from England named Christopher Sarson, and he could see that all of the women in particular were just trying to get at Gene to get a marriage proposal out of him because he was one of the most eligible bachelors in the world at the time. And so the director decided that he would put me in the room to keep all of the other women away from Gene. And so I ultimately, here I am with this person I have no clue about. But very quickly, I realized that we had a lot in common. And my pet study in graduate school was etymology. It was word origins and poetry, and those just happened to be Gene's pet studies as well. So we sat in this room together playing word games and quoting poetry back and forth. And he was, unbeknownst to me, he was kind of testing me along the way and kind of taunting me with these I bet you don't know types of things. And it turned out I did. And by the middle of the week, I was completely enchanted. He was the true Renaissance man. I mean, he spoke French, Italian, Yiddish, read Latin, wrote poetry. He was an economics major, just the brightest mind, just the breadth of the knowledge and the way that he used the knowledge. It wasn't, you know how when you meet some people sometimes and they're trying to impress you with how much they know, and it gets very tiring very quickly. But Gene, it was kind of joy in the engagement with so many different things. He just was tickled by language. He loved words, and he was delighted by poetry. And fortunately, I had memorized quite a bit growing up, and he had memorized a lot. So we just sat there and and not to mention he was extremely charming and very handsome. And so by the end of the week, I didn't know the entire time that he was famous. I didn't know. I figured he was somebody, because they had chosen him to be the host narrator of this show, but I had no idea. And so it wasn't until the final day, he gave me his phone number on a little piece of paper and I gave him mine. And he got in a limousine and drove away. And this woman next to me said, "That guy's really famous, and you should go down to the video store and check it out." And I came back with a stack of video and quite literally binge watched it from Friday to Monday, just one after another. I can't. People ask me what was the first, and I can't tell you, but I just watched them one after another and just stunned at the immensity of the talent and the fact that he had never. I mean, we didn't even connect on that level at all. We connected on his experiences of growing up in the Depression, his telling me about pumping gas during the Depression to pay for college. And I'm thinking, okay, there's a gas pump at the Smithsonian. So I would go write this scene and put him in front of the gas pump. And he talked about watching the 20th century train go by. That was the entertainment for them. And I went, well, there's a train and so I would write very quickly because there really was no script, and I had to write it right on the set. And then they would put it on cue cards and go in and shoot it. and unbeknownst to me, he was watching me do this and the process, kind of, as I say, kind of testing. And several months later, he called me and asked me to come out to California. And he said he had some writing projects for me. And so I came out, and it turns out he wanted me to stay and write his memoir with him. So I said yes, kind of thinking it was probably a couple weeks. And we ended up getting married 5 years into that process. And so I recorded him almost every day in some format for over 10 years. And that's the substance of the two shows that I have touring, all of the work that I do, and then also and the social media posts that people are checking in on all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I really am hoping now in this the coming months to finish the book and get it out. It seems, people say, well, why is it taking you so long to write the memoir? And I said, well, number one, I'm not writing about Ernest Hemingway or something. It's not a detached thing. It's this person I loved and respected and admired, and it's also my life. And so, and it's our life and his life. And so it's taken me this long to really begin to kind of think, what is the story that I want to tell and need to tell? Because I have so much. I mean, I have this, I could tell a story about anything. And to also get the strength to tell it, to kind of get back on my feet after you get knocked by such a tremendous loss. And then to also go out on the shows and listen to people, talk to people. What is it that they want to know about this man? What is it that they don't know about him? What is it that they misunderstand about him? And also to make sure that he's presented the way that he wanted to be remembered, which is really for being behind the camera, not in front. He really would have preferred to have somebody else performing, because he wanted to be directing and choreographing and creating. And a lot of people they'll come up to me and say, did he ever direct anything, or did he ever choreograph anything? And so I've really tried to push that out, how far ahead of his time he was, how innovative, and how he really changed the look of dance on film. He created a new American style of dance and began to use the camera in a completely different way. So that's a little brief story.
Yeah, in a nutshell. All right, before we jump ahead to his legacy and the enormity and how he wants to be remembered, I want to scale it back into like the minutia. What are some phrases, like some Gene isms, something you would always hear him say? Um,
Oh, he
yeah,
was
just like a
full
little bit of a, go ahead.
he was just full of them. And I think of him, and there'll be some that will just make you laugh. But um, if you, uh, he would say things like, if he had something, if there was some new little gadget or something, or I would do some little thing, he said, pretty nifty for 2250. And then he had all these little things, these little rhymes. So if you said it's hard to beat, he'd say it's hard to beat the Board of Health across the street. And if you said, oh, it's really muggy, and he'd say muggy, toogie, and wiggy. I mean, these will make no sense to anybody else, but it's like whenever I hear somebody say, oh, it's really muggy, then all I can think of is that. But he loved the sound of, he would sit in a chair and often just say a phrase over and over again because he loved the sound of it. And one of those was cellar door. So it's cellar door. And then um, there used to be a restaurant on Malibu on the coast, and it was called Gladstone's for Fish. It was called Gladstone's, and there was an ad on TV, and it was, so the guy would come on and go, Gladstone's for fish. And Gene would sit in his chair and just say that over and over with a funny voice. I mean, I would crack up. I would just be on the floor. Um, I think so. Those are kind of some of the funny things, the quirky Gene-isms.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to think of, you're probably trying to think of more professional things. Um, he he did have a phrase that I'm not able to, I can't say, but if he was frustrated with something, or if I would be frustrated with something that happened at an event, sometimes people behaved abominably at events and things. There would be really poor performance, and Gene would say, "Well, F them, they don't get no medal." so so it's just he had a there was a language to Gene, and really lots of kind of funny phrases that would be things he would hear that then would become our little secret language. It would be something that we would see, and he would say it, and it'd make me laugh. It kind of break me
Hmm.
up. So it was more that kind of thing versus he wasn't kind of a guy who just repeated kind of little phrases about work or something. It was more kind of quirky and things with sound and particular words. Poems, like I would say, um, he would use phrases out of American popular song to express sometimes the deepest parts of his life. So when he got close to the bone, he would often revert to a song lyric or a song, and often would sing it, but it would be things like, um, the way you wear your hat, or charming the birds out of the trees, or the nightingale singing in Barclay Square, and as we would drive by. And so he would inject these beautiful phrases that would really touch your heart, because My Funny Valentine, um, uh, I'm not thinking of all of them right now, but it was really a beautiful way that he sort of wove the words of these people he admired so deeply, Rodgers and Hart, Cole Porter, the Gershwins, into the language of our daily life.
Hmm. Would he sing at all or dance around the house, or was there a separation between Gene the performer and Gene at home, or was it all one and the same?
Oh, a complete separation of the two. The Gene on, the performer, was very distinct from Gene at home. And I think that's one of the things that people kind of confuse. They sort of imagine that he did get up and sing and dance around the house, that the guy on the screen, he's so convincing. He's so accessible. I think that's the thing, is that he makes it look so easy and accessible that I think people really, they somehow imagine that that's just who he was. That's just what he did. And what he did do is that we would sit on the couch after dinner, and I would record him often. And before dinner, we would listen to music like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole and things, his favorites. But he would often begin to sing, just to me and just personally, because, as I say, it was a way for him to express something that he preferred to kind of get at it through a song versus directly. It was a way to tell me something without directly saying it. But and he would not dance in public. So if we went to an event, he would never get up and dance in public, and he and Fred Astaire actually started that very early on, because inevitably when they went someplace, everybody wanted them to dance. And Gene said if he stood up, then the entire room wanted him to dance, and every husband came up and asked him to dance with his wife. And so he and Fred Astaire pretended to have bad legs and would kind of hang in the corner. But it was also a kind of thing too that, I think often people assume that performers, I saw it very often, that we would go to people's houses and they would turn to say a singer and ask the singer to perform in the house. And it's like inviting somebody over, a plumber over for dinner, and asking them to go in and fix your sink. I mean, but it's an interesting thing that I saw quite often, and I saw several performers. It really bristled at that. So, but around the house, no, our, it was sitting next to each other in front of the fire, reading a book, reading poetry, listening to music, often going upstairs to turn on a, a movie, an old movie. And he didn't like watching his own movies because he always saw something he could have done better, but we would watch things. It was really, for me, a course in like cinematography 101 and filmmaking 101, because Gene, for example, we watched Stagecoach, and Gene described how the camera was stationary and how people entered the scene and then exited the scene. Whereas Gene used a mobile camera. The camera moved with the dancers instead of being stationary. So it was choreographed as much as the dancers were choreographed. And so we were kind of, that was his ideal way to spend the time, was to have dinner in front of the fire, have a drink before dinner. A lot of my recordings, you can hear the ice in his glass, having a vodka tonic before dinner and recording him, and then having dinner in front of the fire, and then just essentially being quiet together. And very often watching movies. We'd sometimes watch the new movies that came out because he would get the screeners and things. So it was I don't think it's what people assume our life was like. I think they assume it was just one party after another, and he would have preferred just to stay home all the time. And I think he was gracious in that he knew I had never experienced anything like the Academy Awards or these magnificent events, and so he would go to them because he knew that it was a way to introduce me to them, but it wasn't what he enjoyed doing.
Mm-hmm. If you like the work that is being done here at Immortal Icons of Dance, there are many ways you can support. Most simply, you can follow us on Instagram at Immortal Icons of Dance. It would also be great if you could rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen. 5 stars are always appreciated. Did Gene speak of anyone who inspired him artistically, performers, musicians, or directors? When I look up to somebody artistically, I have learned to look at who they looked up to and then to go and study those people. And so I would love to know who he admired.
It's a very long list, and he would appreciate what you're doing, because he really felt that was important and integral for a performer, that you need to study what came before you. You don't just start from scratch. You need to look at what came before, and then you need to acknowledge what came before. And Gene was like a sponge. He picked up everything, and what he did was then he would take it and then make it his own, and modify it. And so, for example, he grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he would go to the shows in the theaters. There were a lot of theaters in Pittsburgh at the time, because Pittsburgh was on the rail route where all the entertainers came through. So he had this enormous array of people, and I'll name just a few, but the list is quite long. And he did acknowledge everybody, really, who came before, and then he knew things. For example, Bill Robinson, the great Bojangles. So Gene so admired the sound of Bill Robinson's taps. He just felt the clarity of those was like no other. And you can see, as Gene explained, there's certain Bill Robinson style steps in Singin' in the Rain in particular. A lot of the crossing over in Singin' in the Rain, the iconic number, those are there. A lot of these are Scottish steps, so it's not only a person, but it's an Irish tradition. It's a Scottish tradition. He studied all the dance in virtually around the world, and then was able to incorporate whatever it was that he needed to play the particular role. So, for example, in The Pirate, you see acrobatics, gymnastics, a West Indies style of dance, but you don't see tap because tap doesn't fit the character, the time period, nor the location. So he studied Spanish dance with a man named Angel Cancino at Chicago Dance Masters, and Angel Cancino was the uncle of a woman by the name of Margarita Carmen Cancino, as you're nodding, as Rita Hayworth. And so Gene picked that up. He studied a lot of the caricature dancers that he really admired, and then would incorporate their steps. A lot of the great balletic performers. He was trained by a woman named Berenice Holmes in Chicago Dance Masters in classic ballet. And she was trained by the great Adolf Bohm in the Russian tradition. And so Gene, so there he acknowledges the connection between Bohm and Berenice Holmes, and then himself. And then he took that and modified it. I mean, he really was trying to popularize ballet in the world. And there was a performer named Dancing Dotson, another Black dancer who came through Pittsburgh, and he did flash numbers. So he was just these extraordinary things on stage. So Gene memorized those, and then you'll see those incorporated in the number he did with the Nicholas brothers in The Pirate, for example. So usually you would have one flash number, one flash step that you would end a number with, but Gene instead took all these flash steps and just put them all together. And so and then I'd say the greatest influence was really not in dance, it was in cinema. So it was Douglas Fairbanks Sr. And Lon Chaney Sr. and John Barrymore. And so I think Douglas Fairbanks, you can just see the connection between Gene, and here's this little boy sitting in these opulent movie palaces watching this incredibly athletic, charming, witty, graceful man. Gene said it was the first time he realized it was okay to be graceful and to be a man, because usually those words didn't go together. And so watching, and Lon Chaney was so balletic in his movement. And so these are non quote dancer people, but you can definitely see the line in those. But we could do a whole series on the influences, and then on the way that Gene then has influenced. You look at people like Usher, Justin Timberlake, Hugh Jackman, Paula Abdul, Derek Huff. It just goes on and on, all the Strictly dancers. And one of the things that I'm working with the International Museum of Dance is where Gene's collection will ultimately go up in the cloud. And one of the things that I'm working with them to do is to create a kind of visual, virtual way of seeing all the connections. So for example, if you, and I'm not quite sure how this will work on the platform. Let's just say you push the button that says Gene Kelly, you will see it shoot out to all the people who influenced him. And then you'll see the connections to Alvin Ailey, who said he became a dancer because of Gene Kelly. And you'll see Bill T. Jones, who said, when I said, did you ever see any Gene Kelly were you influenced? And he said, Nijinsky, Nureyev, Kelly. So I want people to do exactly what you're doing, which is to see that it's all connected, and it just keeps going. So then Gene just Gene flows to here, and then that keeps flowing outward. And I think that's a really important tradition, particularly for dance, that especially since you have this ephemeral form that and physical movement form. I think it's really important to acknowledge and record it, make sure people know where it, from whence all this came.
Yeah. What about contemporaries of his, other performers? Who did he like to go and watch perform?
Those would, well, I would say, let's say it's more in the singers. It would be Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland. But as far as dance, I found in his typed address book the backstage number for the Royal Ballet for the Opera House. So he would call, and whenever he was in town, and then Dame Valvois would put him into the royal box if it was open, and he would watch. But he adored the classical ballet dancers of the world, and wanted really to celebrate them, and that was the point of invitation to the dance. He wanted to showcase for the world dancers they would never have an opportunity to see otherwise. If you didn't go to London or Paris, he wanted to make that accessible. And he said that was his kind of Excalibur ideology, to make ballet accessible. But one of his muses was Claude Debussy, the étoile of the Paris Opera Ballet. She's in his television special. He created the ballet for her. He was the first American-born choreographer to create a piece for the Paris Opera in 1960. And Claude was the muse and performed in it. And so, and the same with, so wherever he went, he always would find the ballet company, or if he went to Scotland, then he saw the Scottish dance performers. He would go to Ireland and see the theater, Samuel Beckett's companies. He was very close with a lot of the actors and the set designer, Sean Kinney. And it's a very broad spectrum. And then sports. I mean, then you have to look at his baseball and hockey and the things that, you're asking if people influenced him. It was sports. I mean, he looked around, he said, well, how does the American male move? There was no model for it. And so he looked at the things he loved, hockey and baseball. And if you watch his dance, it's all very low to the ground, broad, wide open strokes. And so the influences were coming from it. What he took, whatever he needed to create this unique style.
Now, did he ever have any crossover, any communication with Edward Villella? Because they both were, on a similar path with making dancing acceptable for boys and for men, and, doing that through television specials. And the two of them, Edward Villella, and I've been lucky enough to meet him a few times while I work at New York City Ballet, but Gene and Eddie are just my dance crushes. And so I was wondering, did they ever collaborate or speak?
Oh yeah, no. They were, and obviously Kelly's older than Villella, so Villella comes after, and Gene put him in his television special in 1958, dancing a man's game, which the whole point of it was to show that it's okay to be a man and to dance. And so he brought Ed Villella, and it was interesting because Villella was advised not to do the television show because they felt that TV would somehow sully his reputation as a real dancer. And so to be on TV with Gene, but he went ahead and did it. And I've met him, and he's lovely. And so it was a beautiful thing because he showed the connection between, he took Villella and ice skating and showed how it's absolutely this identical, the movements. So what he tried to do was pair for example, he took the Olympic fencing champions came on, and he has them move, and then he has the classical ballet people move, and showing that the footwork is all the same, and moving and turning sideways so that you don't get struck by the sword and so that he talks about the origin of in the royal courts, that the dancing was all men initially, which people forget, and that the dancing followed the fencing, and that came out of how men would defend themselves in battle. And it's all by turning and moving the feet, so that you're able to move without stepping over yourself and everything. So he took this whole history and brought in the top baseball player, the top tennis, top football. You would think in 1958 that this was an omnibus television special, an hour-long special. You would think that we wouldn't be talking about that issue anymore. You would think that this whole notion of, is it okay for boys to dance, and is it a quote sissy thing for boys to do, we'd be done with that. But it sadly is still, in some communities, is still rampant. So I keep trying to stamp that down and try to work with companies. There's a lovely company up in right between Portland and Seattle, and a man by name of Martin Gunter and his wife bring in all these boys. They came to one of my shows. It was 17 boys and 8 girls, and so he has found a way to cultivate it and make it okay, and to bring the men in from the community. And but you're absolutely right. I mean, Ed Villela is just gorgeous, and really Gene absolutely adored him, and so yes, he chose him for that. So, and as I say, it was very nice to see. I met him here when he brought Miami City Ballet here to town. So and it was fun to see the connection then between how much of Gene was in Miami City Ballet. It's all,
Mm-hmm. It's all
you could
connected.
see it all connected. Yeah, it's all connected. It's really fun. It's really fun to watch.
I want to know, did he ever work with, speak with, or speak of Jerome Robbins's West Side Story, the filming of that, or Bob Fosse and, his film work with Cabaret? Did he have thoughts?
People always assume that this is, again, in your connections and the history and the lineage. People always assume that Jerome Robbins influenced Gene. It was actually Gene who influenced Jerome Robbins.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, and people, when they think of the first choreographer at the Paris Opera, they always think of Jerome Robbins or a Bobby Fosse or something. And it was Gene, because people don't readily think of him as a choreographer, which I don't understand. But and Bobby Fosse, Jerome Robbins readily acknowledged Gene as an influence. But Bobby Fosse it was hard to come to that. He'll talk about Fred Astaire, but if you read Sam Wesson's great book about Fosse,
Mm-hmm.
it's he does finally acknowledge it. And I have wonderful pictures of the two of them in New York at the premiere. Cabaret it's interesting. I did not speak at length with Gene about it, and so, but he did not at that point in his life want to be away filming and doing something, so he declined to direct that. So, and he thought Fosse was terrific, and he thought Jerome Robbins was terrific, and all of his friends are in. You've got George Shakiris, you've got Rita Moreno, you've got all these wonderful people who worked with Gene. George in Young Girls of Rochefort, and is a dear man and a good friend. Rita, who's hilarious and always credited Gene with the fact that she was the first time when he cast her in Singin' in the Rain, it was the first time ever she was cast as a non-Latina. So I think you just have. We went to see Jerome Robbins' show on Broadway together, and we went backstage to meet all of the dancers, and it's always fun to do that. Gene was always very gracious about going backstage and shaking hands and taking pictures. I mean, I remember we did it with Hubbard Street here, and he loved Joffrey Ballet and Hubbard and New York City Ballet and ABT and Miami City. I mean, he really, and he followed it. He really followed what was going on. He followed not only what was going on in dance, but he followed what was going on in popular music. So every time the LA Times music critic would write the year's best in the top 10, Gene would have me go out to Tower Records on Sunset to get the little cassettes of them so he could hear what are people listening to now. So I get Prince's Purple Rain and Janet Jackson and all these things. And so I think he was very current with those things. And so, but yeah, I'm not sure if I answered that enough for you or not, but deep mutual respect. I'd say going both ways on both all of those people.
I can hardly believe that the holiday season is already upon us, and Immortal Icons of Dance has gifts for lovers of dance and dance history. To see our selection, head to shop.immortaliconsofdance.com. There, you'll find illustrations of some of our favorite dancers on shirts and sweatshirts and Christmas ornaments. There's also a collection of rare and vintage dance books and ballet programs. The one item that I'm most proud of is the wooden ornament celebrating the upcoming 90th anniversary of Balanchine's Serenade. It was designed, painted, and assembled by my hands in my uncle's garage this summer. There were only 50 made, so it's a very limited edition. Hopefully you can snag yours before we're sold out. To get ahead on your Christmas shopping, head to shop.immortaliconsofdance.com.
Do you know what projects Gene was most proud of? I know you've said that he wants to be remembered more for his work behind the camera. So whether it was choreography and cinematography or any of his performances.
I think it's again, and I used some of these in the show because I wanted to showcase things that he did express. He would see everything. His leg isn't in a perfect balletic position because he had to put it down so Jerry the Mouse could get over it. And but I would say I put a tape recorder next to him as we watched American in Paris, and when we got to the ballet section, he said, "I have to say that I am very proud of that." And so I was glad to hear that, because I think it really shows. I think it shows the breadth of his work, because he is the named director of the American Paris Ballet. It was not Vincent Minnelli for that. It was Gene, and the choreographer and the star, and involved with the costumes, the lighting, the camera. And he recognized it was this completely collaborative effort. But I think you really do see his mark. That's really Gene, I think, encapsulated in the 17.5-minute ballet. And then there were numbers where he would think that he put over a song well, like Can It Be I Like Myself, with Andre Previn's music, and It's Always Fair Weather, when he's roller skating, tap dancing on roller skates. So there were moments, but generally he would say that it was kind of cringeworthy or something. He'd sort of think he always preferred to be on Broadway than in front of a camera. He felt it was much easier to be on stage, and he always felt like he was belting songs out to hit the fourth balcony and performing to the fourth balcony, and that he wished he had done a better job translating that to the camera, which was such a strange kind of what he called a one-eyed monster. So I think he did pretty well. I think he's pretty hard on himself, and I think other people do too. So I would say too, one other one was the Heather on the Hill. He thought was the best pas de deux that he did on screen with Sid Charisse, and it's so beautiful to watch. And And he did think Moses Supposes with Donald O'Connor was the best tap number that he ever did on film. But he would always then say what he thought somebody else's work was, that he would always, instead of just saying, oh, I was the best in this, he would say, I think the best number on film is Bandwagon, is when Fred and Sid come and get into the carriage and everything. And then he also thought Eleanor Powell was really the outstanding tap dancer in Broadway Melody. Was he thought was the greatest tap number anyone did so on screen. So it was really fun I miss that now. I really miss his analysis of things and the way he would see things. And we would watch. There wasn't as much dance on television then. It was kind of rare. And now it's just, you turn on the TV, it's everywhere streaming. But then you might catch a PBS special or something, and he would go through it and kind of talk about how he felt the camera was not in the right place, or just the difference of appearing in front of the camera versus being on stage and things.
Historical Hollywood figures like Gene, they often have reputations that grow to mythological proportions. Are there any common myths that you hear about Gene that you would like to bust?
Oh man, I'm busting myths all the time. I busted a few the other by saying, there's still this myth, and this isn't even about Gene, but the notion that they put milk in the water so you can see the raindrops and sing in the rain. I mean, it's just absurd, and it makes no sense, and yet it just keeps getting perpetuated. It's just beautiful cinematography and lighting. I think the thing about Gene is that I find I just don't even recognize the person, nor do I recognize the person when I speak to other people who worked with him. This notion of being, quote, difficult and a perfectionist. I mean, he hated the word, he hated being called a perfectionist because he said, why would a professional not be that? He said, why would you not aspire to that and to excellence? I mean, he just didn't understand it. And his joke was always, he said, when you go to the surgeon, do you ask for the sloppy guy? I mean, it's a strange thing that somebody, and you will know it, that the sense of Gene growing up in the Depression with a family that lost everything, it's, you don't waste time, someone's time, and you don't waste money. I mean, he really, he was not a guy, it was not easy for him to watch people just spending money unnecessarily, and Xanadu, for example. And so I think choreographers understand, dancers understand, cinematographers, animators, the notion that Gene was choreographing this number in his head, and then he would go in the next day and put it onto the dancers, and then he has to connect it with the music. So he knew that he could accomplish these very complicated numbers and very innovative and really never before seen things like CoverGirl, the alter ego number, and things, because he would connect the movement with the movement of the camera and with musical beats. So all of it was connected to the music. So the camera had to move out and the dancer had to move. And if they didn't hit their mark, then you had to stop and do it again. And he had his assistants behind the camera making sure that and these were big, heavy cameras moving, make sure they got started and that they stopped, and that the way that they panned and dollied was in sequence with the music. And then the dancer, he has to hit his mark. So he had people in front of the camera watching to see, is his head down? Did he turn? Does he match himself? And so I think, I would say when you hear that, oh, he was difficult, I would say you have to consider the source of that comment, because I mean, think he said he would often use the word tough but tender, because he was incredibly tender and romantic and decent and had this great sense of humility and humanity. But he also knew he had to bring in a picture on time and on, you know, on budget,
and under
and
budget,
he
yeah.
had all of these massive people. I mean, you look at what's in the American in Paris Ballet, he's got to get everybody going, and lights, the lights then were so hot, the bulbs would blow and they'd have to stop, and put more dry ice in the fountain, and he's having to think about all this and be in front of the camera and keep it going. And I think, okay, all right, so maybe he was tough in some times, and if you didn't know your lines and you didn't hit your marks and you didn't show up on time and you didn't put in the effort, then yeah, he didn't tolerate that. I mean, in fact, one of his really closest friends was in summer stock, and he was Arthur Lowe Jr. And so he was the grandchild and child of all of the Lowes and all of the studios. And so, but he was a really good friend, but he kept falling off of the table, off the bench. And Gene said, you do it one more time and you're out, And so because he'd then have to shoot it again, have to do it again. And even though he adored Arthur, he just was like, no, that's it. And Arthur got it finally. But I think again, I think professionals understand that, and animators get it because of the precision of the movement and what he had to do. So I think that's a myth. And I think this myth, I've read things that he was not humble. And in fact, he was very humble. He had no big ego. I mean, I think you have an ego. I think you have a certain type of ego to accomplish what he accomplished. I think if you're going to take on and create something like the American in Paris Ballet, that requires a sense of confidence in your skill and in the skill of others. But the sense of a big head or anything, never, ever, ever. And in all the mail and that I have, the many, many letters and telegrams and things I have from people, the musicians, the people behind the scenes, the sound guy, and I think those are the people that can tell you a lot. Those are the people that they're not making up stories. They're just there playing the trumpet or playing the violin, and you get a very accurate thing on that. So I don't buy the lack of humility. I don't buy this notion that his demands were, because he never pressed a demand on anyone else that he didn't put on himself. It wasn't like he was up there cracking the whip and yet he wasn't, because he was there doing it. And so I think that's one that we could stop. And then I think also, I mean, there's this myth about how he broke his ankle to get out of that kept him out of Easter Parade. And you will read these horrific stories that he got it by stomping his foot because he was mad that he lost at volleyball.
Yep,
And
that's what I've heard.
Yeah, and that he it's in Arthur Lawrence's book and it gets picked up, and shame on Arthur Lawrence for the line. He says that he thought he might have heard Gene with some homophobic epithets. You don't write a story like that, that you might have heard something. I mean, so let's just go back to the real story of how Gene broke his ankle. He did have volleyball. They played volleyball in his backyard. He loved volleyball, and he would often bring the Olympic volleyball players on, and he was playing, and his friend, a man by the name of Noel Howard, and Gene both went up for the ball at the same time. Noel was taller. He came down and he hit it, landed right on Gene's ankle and snapped it. And Gene said he knew that he could not recuperate in time to keep the production schedule going. Gene had already choreographed most of our Easter Parade and it was ready to go. And so he thought, oh no, I have to call the studio. And he called in. He said, I think you should get I won't be ready to go. This is going to take a while to heal. I think you should get Fred Astaire out of retirement and come in to do it. And so, in the graciousness of those days, Gene said that Fred Astaire called him and said, is it okay with you if I take your place? And Gene said, yes, I suggested you. So you get Fred Astaire, and ironically, people often think Fred Astaire influenced Gene, but in fact, Gene had already created his own style of dance before he ever even saw Fred Astaire perform. So you see Fred Astaire dancing to Gene Kelly's choreography, and then you also see from that point on how Fred Astaire's choreography changed. So you go from that to things like Bandwagon, and so the influence, I think, is the opposite. And so it's a so I think those would be some of the biggest things. Any kind of cruelty, you'll hear cruelty is just, he was not a cruel man. He was not a cruel, he didn't berate people just for out of malice and things. And in fact, kind of extended, I've gotten letters from some people in the American in Paris Ballet, for example, that they fell off of whatever they were sitting on, and Gene, instead of kicking him off, just said, it's okay, we'll do it again. And so I think we have to look at him as a creative artist who really changed the look of things. And when you talk to somebody like Leslie Caron, I mean, she gets it. She gets him. She credits him with her career. She understood how he used the camera, how he changed the look of how dancers come into the choreographed, how dancers come onto the stage. And also, if you talk to, Judy Garland, if you talk to Sid Charisse, the Sid Charisse thing, you get this myth that she said to her husband, that her husband said he could tell if she had danced with Gene or Fred, because if she came home with bruises, she had danced with Gene. And I think that, particularly in today's climate, that comes off as a kind of abuse. But if you look at the style of dancing of what Gene is doing, for example, in Broadway Melody, I mean, she'd never danced jazz. She had danced only classical ballet, and he had to get her off point to begin to dance. And I think, so yeah, I mean, it's a different style. Gene's dancing with sprained ankles, torn hamstrings. As he said, you dance hurt. It's a masochistic sport. It's very difficult, and to execute the numbers. But he just said they did it beautifully. If you talk to Rita Hayworth, if you talk to Frank Sinatra, I mean, these are people who, many of whom Gene taught to dance or taught a different style. And it was, you don't hear this kind of, you don't hear this stuff about, oh, he was so difficult and stuff. So I think in time, I think in time we're going to, it's going to be in books, because the sad part is books and the internet are just hard to, once it gets started, instead of people going back to primary sources, they tend to just repeat what's been in a book, and then it goes into the internet, and then it becomes fact. And one thing I learned, one of my Melville professors said, never trust the printed word, and he would make me go to primary sources. And the primary sources for the MGM musicals are at the USC Library in the Arthur Freed collection. And I went there for months and just recorded all of what happened on a minute by minute basis on each film. And there are two production assistants who recorded, and I'm not kidding, I don't have one in front of me, but it will say from 9:32 to 9:34, Gene Kelly retied left shoe. And that sounds funny, but it's not, it's true. Or changed pants due to loose cuff. It's also all the lights blowing. It's if there was a makeup need to every detail is recorded because it's a business. So every minute of every day is accounted for in 2 different records. And so the mythology is so easy to bust because you just go back and you see that they're hanging water and rigging, and the water is coming down. And at one point, the people came home and took showers and turned on their sprinklers in Culver City, and they ran out of water and had to stop for the day and come in and hang more rigging. So it's Culver City water that's coming down. It's not milk in the water. And also you can see who arrived on the set at what time. So Debbie Reynolds was she never told the same story in her books, in her shows, whenever she'd introduce something. She was a performer. She was on all the time. And I have letters in the archives here of just the devotion to Gene, and again, giving her a career and asking him to participate in her charitable foundations and do things and show up, which he did. And so I think a lot of her stuff, the bloody feet on the floor, and Jean said, I never saw blood on the floor. And when she said doctors had to come to the set because of her bloody feet, and she had to spend the night at the studio, and exactly when she checks in, exactly when she goes to lunch, exactly when she checks out and goes home. And exactly if a doctor's ever called to the set. So if there's anything that goes on, and for example, doctors were called to the set in American in Paris in the I Build a Stairway to Paradise number, Georges Guéteret is coming down, and all those women in those big headdresses, the heat of the steps and the lights, they were passing out. And so it notes the doctor came to the set and everything. So, but that goes in the book that her feet bled and she had to hide under a table because Jean was being so difficult, and she got all this advice from Fred Astaire. It's just not true. And so we can kind of just suspend that and just kind of go check her accounts and go to the accounts where she says, I owe him my career. And then the rest is kind of, she'd get a laugh and things, but and Donald O'Connor did a similar thing. But again, he was doing 1-act shows, and you just kind of, we went to dinner with him and he told these stories, and I walked out to the car with Gene. I said, you never told me that. He said, it never happened. I mean, I'm directing, choreographing, and starring in this. That never happened. And also the quote breakup with Stanley Donen. No, it didn't happen. So I have letters from Stanley Donen in the archive for Gene's 80th birthday saying, I love you, I owe you my career. So I don't know. Gene was absolutely consistent. And I think that's one thing, because he's directing, choreographing, starring, often producing, writing. He was having to watch the budget, the schedule, his own appearance, everybody else's, and he didn't elaborate. He didn't tend to just modify stories. And what I did as a journalist is I thought, okay, well, he's told this story, so let me go to the archives and check and see if it fits, if it jives. If it doesn't, then okay, he didn't remember it correctly. But for example, he said it took a day and a half to shoot the iconic Singin' in the Rain number. I went there, it shows it took a day and a half to shoot that number. And people will say it was done in one take. It's not done in one take. It's done in multiple takes. And you can see the cuts. He usually turns on a cut, so you don't notice it. He was sick. He did have a temperature of about 103 when he did it, so that's true. But it wasn't this thing of his suit shrinking in the rain. I mean, it's you read this stuff and you just kind of think, the story itself of the making of these pictures is so extraordinary. It's so magical. I don't understand the need to elaborate. I don't understand the need to embellish or to harm people. I think also, I mean, why try to take somebody down, it never is attractive. It's never an attractive quality, I don't think. I think what I liked about Gene was his appreciation for the collaborative effort and acknowledging that the writers, the dancers, musicians, everybody, the grips on the thing. He knew that every person was instrumental.
As always, I highly encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. There's a video version of every episode if you're more of a visual learner, but beyond that, I've created a playlist of videos that are relevant to each episode. More than anything, I want this podcast to be a gateway or a launching point so that you can begin to investigate a piece of dance history that you haven't engaged with before. My interviews could never capture the entirety of someone's experience with these great icons of dance, but the conversations we have here can lead to you discovering more. The playlists include old interviews with the dance icon, vintage footage of them dancing, and I also include links to books that they've written. I try to provide as many avenues as possible so that you can continue your own learning experience.
I think that everyone likes to imagine that co-stars in movies are also best friends in real life. It just, fits the idea that you have in your head of what you've just seen on the screen. Were there any friendships that did carry from the screen into real life between Gene and co-stars?
Oh, definitely. And I'd say the biggest one is Frank Sinatra. Gene said that they were closer than brothers, and they remained closer than brothers to the very end of Gene's life. And Frank helped me immensely at the end of Gene's life, and in a very quiet, no fanfare way. He was just kind and dear, and they adored one another, and they had this friendship that was just enduring, and did 3 pictures together, and we're supposed to do a fourth, and didn't go through with Gene. And then I would say Judy Garland he said mostly he had men friends, but Judy was his real pal. They were real pals, and they would kind of early on, obviously he credited her with his career in front of the camera, and just mutual admiration and adoration. And I think that extended to Liza Minnelli, who is very gracious in acknowledging Gene in her life and the contribution. I mean, our first dance partner was Gene in his television special. It's so charming. And there are many, many photos of the two of them going forward. And he was friends off screen with people like Phil Silvers and Rita Hayworth. A lot of these people, Gene's house was, and you probably read about this, but Gene's house, our house, before it was on Rodeo Drive, and before it burned down, the doors were never locked. So people just came in and would perform in front of the piano. Some people would play a game, kind of form of charades in another room, the game. Some people would be outside playing volleyball. It was just this constant flow of people. I can't even imagine it. I mean, I cannot imagine it, given how secluded our life was, to think about the doors, just people coming in. Gene said he'd come home from the set, have a quick dinner with his assistants, Jeannie Coyne, Carol Haney, Stanley Donen. Then they'd sit down and start working on the next day's shots. And meanwhile, people are coming in, flowing in, doing all this stuff. You'd have Lena Horne singing at the piano. Her husband, Lenny Hayton, would be playing the piano. Leonard Bernstein would come in if he was in town. Noel Coward, Judy Garland would come and sing. Greta Garbo, Marilyn Monroe, just this Betty Comden, Adolph Green, often. I mean, all the New York, it was kind of the New York population of artists came, and choreographers, dancers, the director, Richard Brooks. So it was the place to gather for people from Europe And so the Royal Ballet came to town. So you had Margot Fontaine and Frederick Ashton. So whoever was coming through town, they knew to go to Jean's house. And it was, I mean, there's so many things that I kind of regret, but I would say the opening of Pal Joey on Broadway, I wish I'd seen. And I wish I could have been a little mouse on the floor in that house during that time when so much the people would come and try things out. So you had the composers, Hugh Martin and Ralph Blaine, coming to try out the Meet Me in St. Louis and the next show. So that you'd hear these things before they ever even hit anything. And so, and Phil Silvers would come and break everybody up. He'd sing these songs and crack everybody up. And so I think, yeah, I mean, he had a lot of friends, a lot of acquaintances, and a lot of friendships, and a lot of mutual admiration. As far as very close friends, I would say it was the director, Richard Brooks, the producer, Arthur Lowe, Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, and Betty Comden and Adolph Green were good, close friends. So it was just a plethora of talent.
Would people come to Gene for advice? And what advice did he give? Anything that might be relevant to, performers or creatives today?
Well, it was interesting that people would often come. They'd say, Mr. Kelly, what should I study? What should I study? And he'd said everything. And they thought he meant every form of dance. What he meant was everything. He meant art, literature, philosophy, history, politics, economics, and plus every form of dance, the classical ballet to get the line, jazz to break the line, tap, Spanish, every indigenous dance, every acrobatics, gymnastics. He knew how to walk a tightrope and taught people how to walk a tightrope, like in One from the Heart. And so that was his advice, but I think they'd always thought that he'd just say, oh, study hard, study ballet or study something. But it was the true Renaissance man. And they would always, people would write to him and they'd say, like, my niece wants to be a dancer, or I think she'd be a good dancer. Could you just write her a letter and encourage her to do that? And he said, no, he would never do it, because he knew it was such a tough career and such, as he said, a masochistic sport, that he would never try to push somebody into it. He knew if somebody had what it took and had the commitment, that they would get there. So he wouldn't push people into it. But the guidance, he did a lot with athletes. A lot of the star football players, baseball players would come to him, and he told them to take ballet, and many of them did, and it improved their techniques. Coincidentally, Barbra Streisand called. I picked up the phone, and she called when she was directing Prince of Tides, and talked to him about how to she was having trouble because she was a woman on a set with many men, and how do you get what you want, and how do you get people to do things that are stubborn and don't want to do it. And Jean had to sometimes camera operators and things, like, for example, the alter ego number, everybody said it can't be done. And the director even left the set, said it can't be done, and closed down the show. But the head of the studio believed in Jean and kept it open. So I think it was often advice about things like that. How do you deal with difficulty? How do you break new ground? And then also the commitment to excellence, the commitment to showing up on time, learn your lines, be committed to making it the best it can be. And that may be why we're watching. You have to think about it too. When you were talking about ways he's described, and you think, well, okay, Singin' Rain is 71 years old now. Why are we watching these films? Do you think perhaps that had something to do with the fact that he was trying to make sure everybody was at the top of their game, that no sloppiness was not allowed? So yeah, okay, maybe it was tough, maybe it was hard work, maybe it was, but these are lasting, these are perennial pictures, I think.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that dancers today can learn from Gene watching his work? And then the other part of the question is, and what can non-dancers learn from his life's work?
I think it's not only dancers, I would say it's choreographers and directors and cinematographers can learn that you don't put the camera at the foot and shoot up and try to get some weird angle when you have dancers. And like Gene and Fred Astaire said, you shoot head on and you shoot full figure. If you put it at the feet, the body's distorted. If you're shooting just a close up of a hand or of little feet going like this, or just of a head turning, it's impotent. It's you need the full body and the movement, the kinetic energy of movement toward the camera in order to create a sense of the power of dance. But if you take it and cut it all up into body parts, what does that mean? I mean, and plus you can then use non-dancers. You can use somebody else's head to turn, and you're not even capturing dance, you're just capturing. He hated these quick cuts of MTV and this just chopped up stuff. And I think sadly what Gene did is that he said that he shot in the camera, he edited in the camera, so he used one camera, and that camera, so he knew that by connecting the music with the dance, with the movement of the camera, even though he didn't have a monitor there to check to see if he had done it right, he knew if those were connected and his assistants okayed the shot, if he's in it, he knew he had the shot. And so now they shoot with 8 cameras and just massive amounts of film and tape, and it's all these different weird angles, and then they take that material and turn it over to an editor, and the editors then make the decisions about what's being cut, and the editor may not understand dance or choreography or what a choreographer is trying to achieve and what a dancer is trying to achieve, and the directors often don't know about those things, and the choreographer doesn't perhaps have a voice in all of this, and I think then it's really reduced the quality of the dance in a lot of the television and in a lot of movies and things like that you're seeing. So you're not really even seeing dance, you're just seeing just kind of this body parts flying around. And I think people like Damien Chazelle in La La Land, and I think Greta Gerwig in Barbie, and was much more attentive to the notion of using the camera and staying on the dance and making sure the figures are shown instead of chopping them up. So I think that would be, and also the advice of, for a dancer, your career is very short. It's your instrument. What was so, he said, was the dichotomy of it was that as you're really are beginning to understand your art form, your instrument is in decline. And for men, even at 17, you're already physically beginning. I think now with the changes in physical therapy and some of the attention to injuries and things, dancers are able to dance much longer than they did. And Gene obviously had a much longer career than a lot, but I think he'd say, think beyond, think beyond what that, when that day comes when you can no longer perform, are you going to be a choreographer? Are you going to be a director? Are you going to be a writer? Are you going to paint pictures? Or what? So that's, I think, why he was saying you need this complete study, not only to bring that education and that knowledge to your work, but also so you can go on into the world, because at 40 or 45 or you may have to choose a new form of work.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else? I'm sure there's actually so much else that you would share, but any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us about Gene, or how he specifically himself wanted to be remembered?
Well, I think when you ask the question of is he what people think he would be about singing and dancing at home and everything, I think I don't know, but I think I often find myself saying he is the man you want him to be. He is the man. He is the tender-hearted man, the deeply romantic man, the man who was so touched by poetry and literature and dance and movement and art, and that very often I just see tears coming down his cheek, and he was the guy who would wake me up in the middle of the night just to go out on the balcony to look at the full moon because he thought it was so beautiful. And so I think there's a real tenderness, really romantic in terms of things like Valentine's Day. And he was just excited like a little kid, and I'd find Valentines draped all around the house. And so I think people, and then I think the humanity, the fact that he was in the forefront of a lot of things about fighting for the underdog in terms of actors' rights, writers' rights. As we're coming out of these strikes, he was very very much a proponent of the Screen Actors Guild and trying to fight for actors' rights, and also at the forefront of the anti-lynching lobby in the 40s. I mean, to think that there was no legislation for lynching, and that it didn't pass then, and that all these people like Gene and Paul Robeson and Einstein and everybody got behind it, and yet it was only recently that we're able to get something like that. So I think a lot of people don't think of Gene in those terms as a kind of political person who stumped for John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and was very close friends with them. And so I think, and very astute about economics and what was happening in the world, just always following that. And I think sometimes there's a notion that dancers are somehow not very bright or not very educated or they can just sort of move. They're sort of these animals that move. And Gene was a terribly cerebral romantic Renaissance man. I think that sort of sums him up. It's pretty hard to sum him up. He's a pretty big figure.
Mm-hmm. Well, if people would like to keep up with you in your work and support your work in creating and what am I trying to say? In supporting Gene's legacy, they can find you on Instagram at Gene Kelly Legacy, where you can find almost daily you're posting, memorabilia and letters and photos and, behind the scenes little tidbits about Gene. And is there anything else you'd like to say about that in your work?
Yeah, yes, and thank you. I do try to, I mean, I would love to do it every day. I actually love it. I was so petrified in 2011 when I actually went on Facebook for the first time. I thought, oh no, this is going to be just a bunch of dumb comments. And it's just, and what it has evolved on Facebook, it's Gene Kelly, The Legacy. And I'm on LinkedIn as Patricia Ward Kelly, I think. And so I do respond. So if people send messages, I do get back to people because I think it's this reciprocal. People will say, "Oh, thank you for posting that," and it's like, no, 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 you're here. It goes both ways. If it doesn't work, if I'm just speaking to the air, it's a reciprocal relationship. And the comments that people make have been so enlightening to me, and many so touching to me. People sharing their own experiences, but also the way they see something else in a photograph that I might not have seen, or they express it in a different way. One man was talking about the architecture of Jean's movement, and one about the geometry of it, and both are very important elements of him. And so it's become this tremendous conversation. I've learned so much, and many of the people who come are on there then come to my shows and will say, "Hi, I'm on Instagram. I saw your post about it." So I do encourage people to follow, because I let them know what's coming up, but I take a lot of what people say and put it in, because the books, as you say, as you've read, will say, "Oh, Brigadoon was a failure," or Instagram Invitation to the Dance was a failure, and everything, and or Summer Stock. And then you read that people's like, "I love Brigadoon, I love Summer Stock, I love The Pirate, I love Invitation," and then they tell you why, and you begin to understand. So I love it. And the only part is it takes me about 2.5 hours a day to digest everything, because I do comment on everybody's comment. I do read everything. I do get back to everybody. I try to, I just monitor it all, and it does take a lot of time. So I'm kind of torn, because I'm trying to finish the book about Jean, but I also know that this audience is important as well. And so I'm trying to kind of do both. So I may get to the point where I narrow the social media just a bit, so I can get into the archives and work on the book a little bit more, because I know that's then going to open up a completely different thing. And what I hope to do is more things like this, and where people can actually come on and ask questions and be part of it. So and then jeankelly.com is the official website, and people can sign up on there for notices. And I'm hoping I suspended it just temporarily to get it all organized, and then I'll put that up, and that'll have the lists of shows and what's coming up and different bits and pieces. But in the meantime, you can reach me on all these other platforms. So, and my email is Patricia Kelly at jeankelly.com. So, and I do respond to that. And if you don't hear back, if people don't hear, then it means I didn't get it. And so just keep poking me, because I do respond. And as with you, I mean, this is how this magic happens. You reached out. I mean, it's on you. You deserve the credit, because you made the leap. And that's what I try to encourage people to do. A lot of times I'll run into people and they'll say, "Oh, I didn't want to bother you. I wanted to say hi, but I didn't." And I'm like, say hello, reach out, connect, because if we're not connecting, then why are we on the planet? What's the point if we're not engaging? So I encourage it, not only just with me, but with everybody. So thank you again for the opportunity. I'm just delighted, and I'm here anytime you need anything, any questions or anything. I'm really happy to be in touch.
Well, thank you so much. I know that the listeners of the podcast won't know this, but you can vouch for the fact that I haven't stopped smiling this whole interview. It's made me very happy to hear all these stories and be able to talk to you. So thank you.